This is not a story about conquest. India wasn't taken by an army. It was taken by a signature. In one deal, a private company was given the right to collect taxes from millions of people, like a government. From that moment on, India was no longer ruled by emperors. It was ruled by a balance sheet. Think about that for a second. An entire subcontinent, millions of people, centuries of rule, gone. Not in a battle, in a contract. How does that happen? How does something that powerful give away something that fundamental? That's the question. And the answer isn't what you think. Because this wasn't a mistake, it wasn't stupidity, it wasn't even weakness, it was a choice that made sense at the time. And that's what makes it terrifying. To understand how this happened, you have to understand how power actually works. Let's start with what India looked like before the signature. In the mid-1700s, the Mughal Empire was still the Mughal Empire. Not a memory, not a ruin, a functioning system. Over 100 million people, more than all of Europe combined. It had taxes, it had courts, it had armies. It produced more wealth than almost anywhere else in the world. India already had rulers. India already had taxes. India already had armies. This is important, because you can't accidentally take control of a system like this. You can't stumble into ruling 100 million people. You can't trick an empire this size with a clever clause. Any transfer of power this big has to come from inside, not invasion. So if the system worked, why touch it? Here's the thing, it did work, but working and stable are not the same thing. By the 1750s, the Mughal Empire had a problem. Not collapse, not rebellion, management strain. The emperor in Delhi still had legitimacy. People still recognized him. Regional governors still paid tribute, in theory. But the empire was huge, and communication was slow, and enforcement was expensive. Governors in distant provinces started, acting more like kings. They collected taxes, they kept armies, they made their own decisions. They didn't rebel, they just stopped waiting for permission. The emperor still had authority, but authority without enforcement is just a title. He could issue orders, but if no one obeys, what's the difference between a command and a suggestion? Here's what that looks like in practice. A governor in Bengal stops sending money to Delhi. The emperor writes a letter. The governor says he'll comply. He doesn't. The emperor writes another letter. What's the emperor going to do? March an army to Bengal? That costs money. Money he doesn't have, because the governor in Bengal isn't sending it. You see the problem. This wasn't a collapse. This was a management crisis. The system still functioned, but it was stretching. And stretched systems make bad decisions. Because here's what the emperor needed. Not land. Not glory. Not expansion. Cash. Armies cost money. Loyalty costs money. Administration costs money. And when you don't have money, you have two choices. You cut costs, or you find new revenue. Cutting costs means smaller armies. Smaller armies means weaker enforcement. Weaker enforcement means more governors ignore you. That's a death spiral, so the emperor needed cash. And he needed it fast, and he needed it reliably. The empire didn't need conquest, it needed cash. That's the pressure, that's the constraint. That's the moment when a bad option starts looking reasonable. And that's when the East India Company showed up. Now, if you've heard of the East India Company, you probably think of them as conquerors, colonizers, empire builders. But that's not how they presented themselves, and that's not how they were seen. In the 1750s, they were merchants. They bought and sold goods, textiles, spices, tea. They had trading posts. They had warehouses. They had clerks and accountants. They were very good at one thing, moving money. And by the 1750s, they were better at it than anyone the emperor could rely on. They didn't look like rulers. They looked like administrators, and that's what made them useful. Here's the pitch. The emperor has a revenue problem. Regional governors aren't sending money. Enforcement is expensive. The system is leaking. The company says, we can fix that. Not with armies, not with loyalty, with efficiency. They already run trade operations. They already manage supply chains. They already handle large sums of money across vast distances. So why not let them handle tax collection? You keep authority. You keep legitimacy. You keep the title. We handle the paperwork. We guarantee the revenue. We make the system run. It's temporary, it's technical, it's administrative. Nothing about this looks like conquest. Think about it from the emperor's position. You have a problem. Someone offers a solution. The solution doesn't ask you to give up power. It asks you to delegate a function. Delegation is not surrender. Every government delegates. Tax collection is boring. It's tedious. It requires infrastructure. If someone else can do it better, faster, cheaper, why not let them? Especially when the alternative is chaos. Because here's the other side of the equation. If the emperor refuses, what happens? Does the revenue problem go away? No. Does enforcement get easier? No. Refusal doesn't mean safety. Refusal means the problem gets worse. And the company wasn't a threat. They were already there. They'd been trading in India for over a century. They had relationships. They had infrastructure. They weren't strangers. They were familiar. And that's why it was trusted. The emperor had limited options. The company had proven competence. The deal didn't feel like a trap. It felt like outsourcing. So in 1765, the emperor signed. The treaty was called the Treaty of Allahabad. Most people have never heard of it, but it changed everything because buried in that treaty was one clause, one grant, one right, the right to collect land revenue, the Diwani. That's it. That's the whole thing. The company didn't get land. They didn't get territory. They didn't get the title of rulership. They got taxes, and taxes are everything. Here's why. If you control taxes, you control the state. Taxes fund armies. Taxes fund courts. Taxes fund roads, forts, administration. Every function of government costs money, and if you don't control the money, you don't control the function. The emperor still had his title. He still held ceremonies. He still issued decrees. But decrees don't enforce themselves. You need soldiers to enforce decrees. Soldiers need to be paid, and the money to pay them now flow through the company. If you control taxes, you don't need permission. Let's walk through what this means in practice. Year 1. The company collects taxes. They send a portion to the emperor. They keep a portion for administration. Everyone's happy. Year 2. The emperor wants to raise an army. He needs money. He asks the company. The company says, "We already sent you your share." The emperor says, "I need more." The company says, "We need to cover costs." Who wins that argument? The one holding the money. Year 3. A regional governor rebels. The emperor wants to crush the rebellion. He doesn't have the funds. The company does. The company says, "We'll fund the army, but we'll need assurances." What kind of assurances? Control over the army's deployment. Control over the campaign's outcome. You see how this works. Every time the emperor needs something, he has to ask. Every time he asks, the company negotiates. And every negotiation shifts the balance. The emperor still ruled, but only on paper. Because here's the thing about power. It doesn't announce when it leaves. There was no moment where the emperor woke up and realized he'd lost control. It was gradual, incremental, one decision at a time, one compromise at a time. By the time it felt wrong, it was already too late. So why didn't he reverse it? Why didn't he take the power back? Because he couldn't. This is the lock-in. This is why the decision was permanent. The company now controlled the revenue, which means they controlled the funding, which means they funded their own operations. Every year the taxes came in. The company kept a portion. That portion paid for clerks, administrators, soldiers. The system paid for its own expansion. And here's the brutal part. Any attempt to resist required money. You want to raise an army against the company? You need to pay soldiers. Where's the money? It's flowing through the company. You want to hire administrators loyal to you. You need to pay salaries. Where's the money? You want to bribe a governor to switch sides? You need funds. Every form of resistance cost money, and the money was controlled by the target of resistance. You were funding your enemy. That's the trap. That's the lock-in. It's not that the emperor was weak. It's that the structure made resistance impossible. This is what checkmate looks like in politics. The company didn't need to fight, they just needed to wait. Because every year, The system reinforced itself. More revenue meant more administrators. More administrators meant better collection. Better collection meant more revenue. It was a loop. And loops don't reverse. Within a decade, the company had effectively replaced the Mughal administration in Bengal, then Bihar, then Orissa. Not through war, through accounting. They didn't conquer territory. They absorbed functions. Tax collection became their function. Then law enforcement. Then trade regulation. Then military defense. Each function justified the next. Each expansion paid for itself. The emperor watched, and there was nothing he could do, because the conquest was complete without a battle. This is what power transfer actually looks like. Not armies crossing borders, not flags. Being raised, revenue flowing in a new direction. Once that happens, everything else is theatre. So what changed on the ground? For most people, life continued. The same fields, the same crops, the same villages. But the tax collector was different. The administrator was different. The people writing the reports were different. Local rulers who used to negotiate with the emperor now negotiated with the company. And the company didn't negotiate. They administered. There was no flexibility, no appeals to tradition, no consideration of local custom. Just numbers, just revenue targets, just efficiency. The system became colder, harder, more bureaucratic. And people noticed, but slowly. Because here's the thing about traps like this. The consequences aren't instant. The treaty was signed in 1765, but it took years for people to realize what had happened. At first, it looked like the emperor had made a smart deal. Revenue was stable. Administration was functioning. It was only later, when people tried to push back, that they realized the structure had changed. By the time it felt wrong, it was irreversible. And that's why the trap worked. If the consequences had been immediate, resistance would have been immediate. But they weren't. So resistance came too late. This is the pattern. This is how states lose control. Not in one dramatic moment, in 1,000 small ones. Each one makes sense. Each one is justified. Each one is reasonable. And then, one day, you look up. And the power is gone. So why does this matter now? Because this pattern didn't die in 1765. Revenue control still precedes political control. If you manage someone's money, you manage their options. This is why modern power rarely looks like invasion. It looks like efficiency. It looks like partnership. It looks like help. Until it doesn't. The same mechanism still operates today because power hasn't changed. Only the paperwork has, because the lesson isn't about India. It's about how power leaves. It doesn't leave loudly. It doesn't announce itself. It leaves quietly. In contracts, in clauses, in delegated functions. And by the time you notice, it's already gone. So here's the question you should sit with. How could someone this powerful sign this away? And the answer is simple. Because it didn't feel like surrender. Because it felt like survival. Because at the moment of decision, it seemed reasonable. That's the terrifying part. Not that the emperor was tricked, but that he made a rational choice. He looked at his options. He weighed the risks. He chose the least bad path. And the least bad path led to total loss of control. That's not stupidity. That's pressure. And pressure makes people sign things they shouldn't. Because power rarely announces when it leaves. It just sends a contract and waits for a signature. Empires don't always fall. Sometimes they're signed away.